This is a quick primer of Massachusetts school finance. This isn't intended to give every level of detail, but will give an overview for those who might just be starting to understand how it all works. The first question, of course, is why should you give any of this your time? Well, if we can't spend money on it, we can't do it in terms of public education. How we spend money, of course, is an expression of our values, and that very much is true for education. School funding is often tied to wealth, to class, and to race. And funding for school does actually matter for student outcomes. Schools are a place in the United States where we try to level the playing field, and understanding how it works, we can do that more effectively. And ultimately, schools are a part of how we protect and maintain democracy. Now, how schools are funded matters. If schools are only dependent on local resources, as traditionally has been true in many places, those districts with more resources will fund schools more, while those with fewer resources will fund schools less. In Massachusetts, we have several relevant documents when we talk about public education and funding. The first is the first public education law in Massachusetts, which was passed in 1646, the Old Deluder Satan Law, memorably titled, which established a system across the colony for public funding of public education. That was followed by the Massachusetts State Constitution, which was passed in 1780, which is the first state constitution in the country to have a section that talks about public education. Public education is a requirement of the state, something that the state is required to provide by the Constitution. And as the Constitution says, that is because it is necessary for the preservation of our rights and liberties. That was followed up in 1993 with the SJC decision, McDuffie versus the Secretary of Education, which found that the Constitution's words were not just aspirational or hortatory, but were obligatory. In other words, the state actually has an obligation from the state constitution to fund public education across the state. That led to the passage of what was then known as the Education Reform Law, and that included Mass General Law Chapter 70, which is the portion of the law that lays out how we fund public education in Massachusetts. This, of course, also gives us our shorthand for public education aid, K through 12, which we often refer to as Chapter 70. The first question then is, how much does it cost to educate a child in Massachusetts? The state needs a statewide standard for that. They start to do that by calculating how much is needed for each child in a number of areas that we consider part of public education. Those are bundled together in what we call the base foundation amount. To that is added a couple of areas of need. One is an English language learner increment for those who might be learning English. And the other is a low income increment for students who are being raised in poverty. That second is also a change in increment depending on the concentration of poverty in a district. To that is added a flat percentage of enrollment counted as special education. That is not actually tied to the actual amount of students in a district that have special education needs. That then, for a district, is put together in what's known as the foundation budget. That's a per pupil increment plus the additional increments on top of that added together to make a district level foundation budget. And that is what is the fair and adequate minimum described in Mass General Law Chapter 70. Then, of course, we have to figure out how we're going to fund it for each of the districts. So the state actually takes two things together in order to figure out the local funding effort. It takes a standard measure of income, as reported in tax returns to the Department of Revenue, and a standard measure of property wealth, as reported by towns to the Department of Revenue. Those together give what's called a combined effort yield, which I would refer to as a measure of the ability to contribute for each community in the Commonwealth. It's a standard way of saying, here's how much money we think that you can put towards your public schools. So in putting it together, there's a foundation budget for every district. And in putting together that foundation budget, in funding that foundation budget, the first thing that happens is the state comes up with a calculation of how much of that can be funded locally. And then in order to get to the rest of the need for the foundation budget, the state fills in the gap with Chapter 70 aid, or state aid for public education. Now, just to give an idea of how this looks in principle, I've taken two districts here that have similar foundation budgets, Pittsfield and Brookline. So Pittsfield has a $78.7 million foundation budget. And in order to contribute to that, what Pittsfield has for their combined effort yield is $29.7 million. Brookline has a fairly similar foundation budget of $77.2 million, but their combined effort yield is $172 million. Now, of course, what that means, first of all, is that those two districts are going to have very different levels of local contribution. Brookline can afford to contribute more to their local schools. And then the gap between that and their foundation budget is filled in with Chapter 70 aid, in which case Pittsfield is going to get more because they need more in order to fill in the gap to get to their foundation. But that isn't where funding stops for public education in Massachusetts for districts. Most districts get grants of some kind or another, both federal and state. And then, of course, there's nothing to preclude towns from additionally contributing to their public schools. In the cases here, both Pittsfield and Brookline do. But because they have very, very different levels of resources available to them, they contribute at very different levels. And so we still end up with a fairly inequitable system at the end of the day, despite the efforts of the state to have a more equitable system through Chapter 70 aid. Now, because there has been so much disparity, and because it is clear that districts felt that they needed additional resources for schools than were simply provided by the foundation budget, in 2019, Governor Baker signed into law a bill that had been passed unanimously by both houses of the legislature, called the Student Opportunity Act. The Student Opportunity Act has a significant number of pieces to it that are put together to change how we fund public education and to either study or improve parts of the foundation budget and other aspects of public education funding. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, the first year of the Student Opportunity Act was not funded this past year. Thus far, it appears as though it will be funded for FY22, which is the budget that we're considering currently. So what is it that you can do in order to be well informed and to further influence public education? The first thing is to know your own context. What is your district's funding sources? How dependent are you on local funding and on state funding? Know your timeline. When are decisions made that impact your district? There are both local and state decisions that make a difference in terms of how districts are funded. Know the impacts, particularly if you are someone who's at the local level. What difference does it make to you that your school be adequately funded? And then tell your story. It really is telling the story of how budgets make a difference, that make changes at both the state and the local level for those who make decisions. And finally, don't give up. Change takes time and it takes persistence, but you have allies and you should stay with it. Public education is well worth understanding because it's something that we all depend on, not only for the education of our children, but as the state constitution says, in order to protect and to continue democracy.